Hey everybody, welcome back to the Sem Says podcast. It's a podcast where seminarians say what's said at the Sem. I'm your host, Alex Brown. Now today I'm joined with my esteemed classmate, Anthony Albanese. Anthony, welcome.
Hello, welcome. Thank you.
I'm really happy you could join us today.
Yeah.
I've wanted to have this conversation for a long time. Anthony is our resident linguist, I'd call him. I was taking inventory before we started this podcast. You've studied 6 languages at least, right?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that?
Yeah,
Not more.
Yeah. Well, I'm fluent in Spanish, yo hablo español, and I'm very proficient in Italian. And, of course, we all study here at the seminary Greek, Latin, and I also took Hebrew as well.
Took Hebrew? Okay.
So, yeah.
And, of course, English.
Of course, English. Yeah,
English is your native language, right?
That's right.
Okay,
That's
very
right.
good.
Yeah.
Very good. So I was hoping in the podcast episode we can delve into the nuances of language, how that affects spirituality, how that's affected you in your life, kind of why you're into it, just really explore the whole gambit.
Sure.
But to get started, so tell us a little about yourself. You're studying for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. What did you do before entering seminary? Why did you enter seminary? Who is Anthony Albanese?
Right. So I didn't really start thinking about the seminary until like 2011. And really to go back even further, in 2008, I had graduated from Villanova University with a bachelor's in Spanish and education. And then I started teaching Spanish in 2008 in Bensalem, at a middle school in Bensalem. And, you know, the first couple of years, I also got my master's in education from the University of Pennsylvania. And then really in my third year, which was 2011, something really important happened. I was working with the students, working with the teachers, working with the families and everything. And I just felt the need for Jesus, really, in their lives. And I felt Jesus asked me on my heart, who do these students, these 7th and 8th grade students, who do these students really need? And now, I was a Spanish teacher, of course, at the time, and Spanish teachers are very noble profession, very necessary to have them. We need to be able to speak Spanish, I think, especially in this country, more and more as years go on. But I just felt he was asking me maybe to go a bit further or a different route and maybe become a priest and be Jesus for people like these students and the families and everything. So in 2011, I basically went on my first come and see retreat here at the seminary. And it just wasn't the right time, though, for me to enter for a variety of reasons. So I went back to teaching, and then actually in 2012, I left Bensalem, and I thought I wanted to be a medical doctor.
Oh, okay.
So then I went to Jefferson for 2 years, realized I didn't want to be a doctor after I took the MCAT, the test to become a doctor, and then went back to teaching. And then this is really the pivotal part. In 2014, I was at my parish. I had just lectured from my parish mass on Sunday. And the priest had come up to me afterwards, not knowing that I had previously discerned the call. He said, "Have you thought about the seminary?" And I looked at my dad and I said, "Yeah, I have." So my dad and I knew that day was the annual Christmas concert and open house. So I said to my dad, "All right, let's go. Let's check it out." So I met with the current vocation director, Father Steve DeLacy. Mm-hmm. And the rest is really history. It took a year for the application to go through, but ultimately I started in fall of 2016, the spiritual year.
Okay, sure.
And it's been just a blessing and everything. And the languages really have been a tremendous part of my life, not just before the seminary, but in the seminary too. Like a couple years ago in the seminary, so this is my 5th year in the seminary. Mm-hmm. A couple years ago, I was able to start a Spanish table and an Italian table. So in the refectory where we have our meals, basically the cafeteria, we used to have a table of conversation in the various languages.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool.
One day would be Spanish, one day would be Italian. There was even, I think, a German table at some point.
Yeah, I think that wasn't as long-lived as the others. Yeah. For whatever reason.
Yeah, you were a part of that, weren't you?
German? No, my German is not up to snuff as it's about to be. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So the Spanish table and the Italian table were tremendous things and everything. We were able to get conversation going. You know, I kind of liken it to linguistically sparring.
Okay.
You know, when you spar, you're just kind of going at it in karate, let's say. working on your skills as a holistic approach. And that's kind of how I see the tables. But yeah, so Spanish has been tremendous. Just this past fall, I was able to take really my first Spanish class in a long time. It was pastoral Spanish with Father Gus Esposito, rest in peace. And it was a tremendous class because there's only 4 of us, and it was an upper level class. And we did things like role plays. We did things like different listening activities and different speaking activities based on videos that we would watch and listen to. It was really tremendous. And then it's kind of going out of order here, but back on spiritual year, which was my first year, so that was 2016, 2017, we have apostolates, right? And apostolates, of course, are those field assignments that you may go to parishes or soup kitchens or different areas where you go do some kind of service and pastoral work.
Right, just to get a feel for the ministry going forward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So for a spiritual year, my parish assignment was Father Gus Paleo. Do you know Father Gus?
No, but I'm not from the diocese.
That's right. That's right. He's just tremendous, absolutely excellent mentor and everything. I went there for Tuesdays, I think it was, for his parish in St. Patrick's in Norristown.
Okay, sure.
We got to speak a lot of Spanish with him and everything. And he used to be a Spanish professor at Columbia University.
Oh, okay.
So he's really, really good at Spanish and everything. Well, there's other languages too, like you said, that I've studied and everything. Of course, if you're listening and you're not familiar with the seminary program, all seminarians take Latin and Greek, at least a year. You took 2 years, didn't you?
2 years of each, yeah.
2 years of each, because you went through the college.
Right.
I went through pre-theology. We had to take 1 year each of Greek and Latin. And I'm a sucker for language.
Yeah.
I just, because I remember in philosophy, when we studied in philosophy, they said about learning for the sake of learning.
Right.
Not for any particular end, but just for the sake of itself, the end in itself. So that's how I see languages. I see it as like a hobby. And, I'm not necessarily like the best linguist in the world by any means, but I just enjoy the communication of languages. So Greek was really good. Latin was really good. Latin, of course, was great because after having studied Spanish and Italian, they're rooted in Latin.
Yeah, you already had the jump on it.
Right. They kind of have that Romance language thing going on. And then, of course, I think it was last spring, so a year ago, I guess.
Sure, yeah.
I took Hebrew with Dr. Kelly Anderson. That was tremendous. I mean, you talk about a tough language to learn.
Yeah, going from the Romance languages to the whole backwards.
Oh, yeah.
No vowels.
No vowels, dots as the vowels,
right.
Characters and everything. Like, that was tough. That was tough. But it was really enjoyable, though. I really appreciated the class. Of course, there was only 3 of us in the class.
So you had to do your homework. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah. Right. But I tell you, and you know this too, Alex, with a lot of our classes, the professors bring in Greek and Hebrew words and stuff. So it is nice to be able to maybe at least pronounce the words that they're bringing in, like, berit, which was the covenant that we learned, for example. So Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, maybe this sounds nerdy of me, I don't know, but it just sounds exciting to explore the scriptures in the various languages and how it's different. And right, we were mentioning this before we went on. Knowing the different languages can definitely be beneficial, more fruitful even in praise and worship and liturgy.
That's right.
So, for example, in the English Mass, we have a priest at one point in the Eucharistic prayer, he says, the mystery of faith, right? Well, the Spanish Mass, there's really 2 options that the priest could say. Este es el sacramento de nuestra fe, or este es el misterio de nuestra fe. So this is the sacrament of our faith, this is the mystery of our faith. So he can really say both possibilities, either one of those possibilities in the actual Mass in Spanish. And we talked about this, right? Mm-hmm. So the word mystery is kind of directly related to the word sacrament. You probably could do a whole series of podcasts on why that is and what we learn in class.
Exactly.
Needless to say, the mysterion in the Latin and sacramentum in the Latin are very related to each other, suffice to say. Do you know other languages?
I took 3 years of Irish Gaelic in high school.
Wow.
which was a great experience.
So you're able to speak a little bit of it?
So I haven't spoken anything since I entered seminary 6 years ago. So it's a lot of it's rusty. I still try to keep up whatever basic phrases, conversational phrases I had. At the most, my claim to fame was when I went to Ireland and had a very nice conversation with a very nice fourth grader.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. That's awesome.
So thanks. That was the peak, my peak study right there.
Yeah. I can communicate with a fourth grader.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Because they learn it in schools now. They're trying to bring
right.
it back in culturally. It was lost for so long, being so close to continental Europe, England. That's when I went to Ireland. As soon as schools let out, everyone on the street was speaking Irish, all the teenagers. So it was very awe-inspiring to see. My Irish teacher always used to say, language is a glimpse into the psyche of a people. So, for instance, in Irish, if you say you like something, you don't say that you like it. Of course, it wouldn't be that straightforward. You would say, it's mahu, it is good with me. It's a very passive sentiment. And a lot of their idioms are like that. They're passive.
Right.
You'd say how the world affects you rather than how you affect the world. It's different. It shows that the Irish have a very cosmic understanding.
Right.
Has that been apparent to you in your study of languages? Have you seen like little nuances between cultures?
Sure, absolutely. The one thing that pops up in my mind is the construction in Spanish, me gusta.
Sure.
Me gusta la manzana, por favor, or por ejemplo. So that's, I like the apple, but what you're really saying is the apple is pleasing to me. And that kind of like shows like a certain, I don't know if passivity is the word, passiveness to the person speaking, but the subject of the sentence in that sentence is not I.
Right.
Right? The subject is the apple, right? So it's what is pleasing, is the subject.
Mm-hmm.
So that really shows an interesting feature. And I think that relates a lot, honestly, Alex, to the cultural aspect and the religious aspect of a lot of Hispanics, as Catholic Hispanics. Because like we often say that God has graced me. You know,
Sure, yeah.
Or, God was gracing me in this moment in my life or something. That it's really, the subject is God, not us. God loved us.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Not that we loved God per se. Obviously our love for God is important.
Of course.
But it's more important, like, again, John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. That's one example, yeah. Just today we learned that perfect passive participle.
Right, for the enunciation.
Right, for the enunciation. Right. Do you remember the Greek? I forget the Greek.
Yeah.
It's a long word in Greek. But that just goes to show you how God was working in Mary's life.
The word in English is you who have been filled with grace. It's what Gabriel says to Mary. It's how he addresses her. So it shows that Mary was conceived with grace, or at least, if not conceived, as the church has held. In that moment, we see that she has been filled with grace before the angel even showed up, showing that she is a fundamental part of God's plan. That's what it was in English.
Right. It's just such a powerful way of expression, that we don't always maybe readily use in English.
Right.
Just because it's a different construction. It's just a different way of looking at things. And, it's funny, when I used to teach Spanish, the students would often be like, Senor Albanese, why is it like this? Why are we learning it backwards?
Yeah.
Because me gusta la manzana, por ejemplo, is like from right to left, really translated. And I said, it's just another way of expressing it. And that's just the way that the Spanish language operates with, of course, roots in Latin, like we said.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, like I said, I'm really enjoying like a lot of like the scripture classes.
Sure.
That have like the Greek involved and everything. And even when we did Theology of Grace with Monsignor McGee and the other classes we had with him, he brought in a lot of the Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it just enlivens the experience and the vocabulary and the word usage. So to be able to learn and study in these original languages is a privilege and an honor.
Sure. Absolutely. That's like, I remember when I took Greek, we studied Mark, and Mark has a lot of present verbs. I think more than the other Gospels. Luke, of course, cleans up the Greek quite a bit.
Yeah.
Luke is a very professional writer. But when Mark writes, it's a very exciting, very present storyline. So, for instance, in Mark, how do I put this? You can express the past with present verbs to make it more actual for you. A popular example is he shoots, he scores, right?
Right.
Mark does the same thing when talking about Christ, and whenever he makes something present, it usually holds relevance for us in modern day. So I remember for my final for Greek, I wrote an essay on the tearing of Christ's clothes, when it says not that they tore his clothes, but rather they tear his clothes popularly. And you're left to wonder if they're actively tearing his clothes. What are we denying from Christ now? What are we taking from Christ?
Yeah.
Stuff like that, it can be very pertinent for meditation. Just a thought for going back to the Greek.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. In other words, without the Greek influence there, we may not have otherwise thought of it that way,
Right.
or just by ourselves or something, And of course, we have a number of Hispanic students, seminarians here. So that's always a rich addition to the seminary, culturally and linguistically,
Right, yeah.
and everything. So they bring a very nice flair. And of course, we couldn't have it this past December, but because of COVID. But the Guadalupe celebration, Our Lady of Guadalupe.
That's always such a special time.
Oh, yeah. And again, of course, Father Gus Esposito was really integral in planning all of that. And it's unfortunate, very unfortunate that he had to pass.
Mm-hmm.
In years past, the Guadalupe celebrations have been tremendous. And that's another thing. So I think it's really important, Alex, not to separate, and not that we are or anybody is, but not to separate language from culture.
Right. It's very important. Because
they are really intricately tied to each other. The culture is expressed in the language, and the language is expressed in the culture.
Mm-hmm.
I think of like in the Hispanic culture, a lot of times, instead of like the Sweet 16 birthday for girls, they celebrate the, if you will, the Sweet 15, or the quinceañera.
Right.
The word even quinceañera is like 15th birthday girl or something.
Yeah, sure.
You can actually call the girl the quinceañera.
Okay.
That's expressed in the culture and everything, and the party that they have and everything, the celebration. I'm pretty sure there's a religious component to it too. I think.
Right. So it would be a little lost on me, but I remember at my summer assignment 2 years ago, they had a quinceañera, not a mass, but they got the family came before the altar and had for a blessing and just a little liturgy, I guess you'd call it. Would you still call that a small L liturgy?
Yeah, sure.
But it was definitely came before the altar and had a ceremony with the priest to get a blessing.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, and there's so much richness to the cultures of these languages and everything. And I think in some of our classes we looked at Hebrew culture and maybe Greek culture, maybe a little bit. So that just makes the language come alive.
For the Greek culture, what we're learning recently, Luke begins his prologue for the gospel. Luke begins his gospel with the formula for a historical narrative.
Right.
So that pattern of speech in the Greek matches contemporary histories, showing that Luke knew what he was talking about. He presents it like an academic work. So it's something that a contemporary Greek scholar, an ancient Greek scholar rather, would read and say, "Oh, this guy's legitimate. What I'm about to read is true," without any doubt in his mind.
Sure.
But that's something that we don't really think of, both for taking the gospel for granted, having lived with it for so long, and also it being in English, and we don't have that Greek formula, that Greek academic formula anymore.
Right. And of course, we know that from our Greek studies that the Old Testament Greek is typically called the Septuagint Greek.
Right.
And then, of course, you have New Testament Greek. And we also learned, along with what you were just saying, that the Greek that Luke uses corresponds to whether it was meant for the Old Covenant or had Old Covenant flair to it,
right,
versus the New Covenant in the New Testament. And so, like, when he uses Old Testament Septuagint Greek, we know that that's that change, and it was meant the Old Covenant being then fulfilled in the New Covenant. I just think that's really, really cool, quite frankly, that he uses the grammar and the Greek and the language to convey these kind of religious truths and these historical truths. in the two covenants and everything, and the one covenant overall. And I just think that's like better than sliced bread.
High praise there, right?
Yeah, high praise,
High praise.
high praise.
So I remember we were talking in a scripture class how important it is to match what we're reading with the tradition of the church. Our professor had the example of God is now here on the board without any spaces in it, like Greek would be written.
Right.
So you don't know whether it says God is now here or God is nowhere. Do you remember when that was up? So it's important to have the scholarship of the language rooted in the scholarship of the theology and the tradition of the church, both working at the same time, so you can authentically read into the ancient texts.
Right. And quite frankly, I know some people that I know, I'm actually friends with, but have differences with the church and so forth. They say, why do we have a magisterium?
Right.
Or anything like that, which of course is the Pope and the bishops in union with the Pope. And, this is one small example of why we have the magisterium. So they can, shall we use the word interpret?
Right.
Interpret the scriptures and not change the meaning at all at any of them, but just to make them more accessible for the rest, for the presbyterate, for the priesthood, and for the rest of the laity. So that's really important. You bring up a good point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because you could give me a scroll of Hebrew and a Hebrew dictionary and 5 or 6 years, and I'll be able to get through it.
Yeah.
But I mean, I it'll say something say something very different than what God intended to have said.
Yeah. So that's really good. And so, like I said, I was assigned to a Hispanic parish in spiritual year.
Right. Yeah. Getting back to that.
Yeah. And who knows, what God has in store, what the seminary has in store. It would be interesting to be in a Hispanic parish now that I'm in theology, because third theology, so of course we're in second theology, but third theology, a lot of them are taking a practicum for the sacraments in Spanish.
Right.
You've heard of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's really, really good and really, really cool to be able to enter into the, sacramental ministering in another language. So, and of course, all of those men are preparing to become deacons in a short while.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll be really, really good.
Yeah.
For them. And again, I'm jealous.
All in good time.
All in good time. All in good time. Yeah. One thing I don't know if people really appreciate, honestly, Alex, this is kind of off topic with the languages, but, the seminary is not like the easiest place to be in a lot of times. You know what I mean?
I mean, I hear things about that. Yeah. I've always enjoyed my time here.
Always enjoyed the time. And I thoroughly enjoy being here as a seminarian. But, obviously, in any endeavor in life, there can be ups and downs. There could be particular challenges and so forth and so on.
Right.
So I think we all experience that no matter what walk of life we're in. So prayer is so important. And, I've been able to, because of my Spanish, sometimes pray in Spanish.
Right, exactly.
Whether it's the rosary or contemplative prayer or what have you. So, because, of course, I think we would agree Jesus knows all languages. There's no barrier there.
Right.
No matter what language you speak to him.
I would be inclined to think that he speaks Latin primarily.
Primarily, that's right. That's his first language.
That's Christ's first
Aramaic,
language.
Yeah. So, that's tremendous. And, to be able to not just talk in another language, but to pray in another language, that's really, really powerful.
You can get at the heart of deeper expressions, things you wouldn't usually say, or it might sound clunky in your own language, in your first language, rather.
Yeah, something like Spanish and Italian, it really is like emotional, and passionate, the language. And, of course, even just the culture of those languages. Mm-hmm. And, you can be really, like, expressive. I feel like a lot of times when I speak Spanish, I feel like the more expressive I am with the language, the more I'm kind of almost, if you will, accepted into the culture.
All right, interesting.
I think it's just my take, but, because it's such a powerful endeavor or language. You've taken Spanish, right?
Spanish, 1 year of Spanish, too.
1 year of Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Did you take it in high school or?
I took it here at seminary. Father Esposito taught us.
Oh yeah, nice.
And he was good about teaching us pastoral Spanish, so things you wouldn't get in Intro to Spanish course. So like
Sure.
our vocabulary words were parochial, curate, rectory.
Yeah, and that's why I didn't. I was wondering whether to take the class in the fall, this past fall, and some guys were like, "Oh, why are you taking Spanish? Because you already know Spanish." And I'm like, "Well, but it's the pastoral side.
Mm-hmm.
You can know like conversational Spanish. Then there's also pastoral Spanish, Spanish in the parish, Spanish for the sacraments, and that sort of thing. So there's a couple different, if you will, registers or types of language that you could know. Just because I had a good level of conversational Spanish didn't mean I have a good pastoral Spanish level.
Sure.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's any situations where you could offer comfort in, transliterating in your mind. Someone's in the hospital or comes to you for advice, speaking Spanish, and you want to say like, be joyful or be at peace. You want to say something benign like that, but you end up saying something idiomatic that just makes no sense or does more harm than good. I can't really think of any examples off the top of my head, but like, I don't know, maybe say something like you meant to say be joyful and you actually meant to say like be angry or something like that. You know what I'm getting at?
Right,
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, well, I'm sure the expression on their face and what they may say to you would probably tip you off whether you said the wrong thing or not.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing that I've noticed. Is that, of course, Spanish is not my native language, right? It's my second language.
Right.
But the reality is, when I speak Spanish to native speakers, I can't generalize for all of them, but for a lot of them, they just appreciate that I'm trying to speak their language. More than trying.
Oh yeah.
They're just very appreciative of that I would take the time to actually learn their language. Especially in a country that is predominantly English speaking,
Mm-hmm.
although Spanish speakers are increasing by the year and everything.
Of course, yeah.
So that's really good.
Well, we're actually kind of winding up on the. I know we can keep going talking, but we're a little bit running out of time here. Kind of winding up. So thank you very much. If there's anything you want to encourage our listeners to do, if you don't have a second language, what's something that maybe our listeners can do to be exposed to a variety of languages held in the church or expand their thinking? Anything you want to leave our listeners with as a tidbit?
Sure. Well, there's a couple things you could do. If it's a modern language, say like Spanish or Italian, you certainly could use the internet to your resources, and you could listen to radio in the language. You can read newspapers in the language. You can take classes in those languages. I'm sure Spanish and Italian are very readily able to get classes as adults. And then, of course, if it's one of the more ancient languages like Greek or Hebrew or Latin even, again, the internet has great resources, and there probably is even learning classes for those as well. I encourage you definitely to explore those languages, even if it's an introductory class, just to get a taste.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's how I started. I started with a taste of Spanish. It was a third of a school year in Spanish. And then here I am after having taught for 6 years and in the seminary using my Spanish a lot. So just a little taste is sometimes all you need to get the inspiration going with what you might be interested in.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to like dive into the Summa Theologiae and the Latin or everything. Unless you really wanted to.
You could, I suppose. You could.
Yeah.
You know what I'm thinking about? Making that joke about how Christ speaks Latin. In the Passion of the Christ, you ever watched the Passion of the Christ?
Sure.
When Christ speaks to Pontius Pilate, I think Pilate addresses him in Aramaic, and Christ responds in Latin, which I think is a very interesting.
Wow, yeah.
Shows the universality of Christ's person.
Sure.
So I don't know if you want to. I'm not sure if that scene is isolated on the internet, but I think I'm going to try to look that up later.
Yeah, definitely. Send that to me.
Sure.
Yeah. So
I think that's all we have today. I know we can keep going, but don't want to go well into the night.
Right.
How do you say thanks for listening in Spanish?
Gracias por escuchar.
Gracias por escuchar.
Yep.
All right.